this was about the gray matter of the spinal cord. Now let's talk about the white matter of spinal cord. White matter, it consists of a mixture of nerve fibers, neuroglia, and blood vessels. The white color is due to high proportion of myelinated nerve fibers. Okay, the white matter of the spinal cord is going to be arranged in columns or fasciculi, namely anterior, posterior, and lateral. So white matter is divided into anterior column, posterior column, and lateral column. It consists of high proportion of myelinated nerve fibers. That is why it is white in color. So the nerve fibers, they are arranged in bundles and they run vertically along the or vertically through the cord. Okay, so they are going to be arranged in small bundles and they are going to run vertically, right? So it can be ascending or descending. A group of nerve fibers that share a common origin, termination, and function, they form a tract or a fasciculus. Okay, so we talked about nerve fibers when they are so what exactly is a tract? The nerve fibers are a group of nerve fibers when they are located within the CNS. It is called as a tract, right? So what kind of nerve fibers or what kind of group is it going to be? That it shares a common origin, termination, and function. So only these group of nerve fibers will form one tract or a fasciculus. These tracts are formed by the sensory nerve fibers, right? So sensory nerve fibers are going to be ascending, that is from periphery to the center, ascending to the brain. Motor nerve fibers descending from the brain, and fibers of the connector neurons, that is the interneurons. We talked about interneurons also. They are connections between the sensory and the motor neurons, right? So these tracts, they are going to be either sensory tracts or motor tracts, right? Sensory tracts will always be ascending tracts. Motor tracts will always be descending tracts. Okay. They are often named according to their points of origin and destination. Let's say, for example, spinothalamic. So if we talk about spinothalamic, then the origin is going to be in the spinal cord and the termination is going to be, as the name suggests, thalamic. That means in the thalamus. Okay. Or another example is corticospinal tract. So as the name suggests, cortico, that means the cortex, brain cortex. So the origin is going to be in the cortex and the termination is going to be in the spinal cord. So depending on their function, they are divided into ascending and descending tracts, which we already talked about. So the ascending tract is going to be, ascending tracts are going to be sensory and descending tracts are going to be motor. Okay. So here in the picture, as you can see, this is the TS or the transverse section of the spinal cord. This is the dorsal surface. This is the ventral surface. This thing is the white matter. Okay. White matter, it consists of all these tracts or all the group of nerve fibers. So which are the ascending tracts? These are dorsal columns, also known as dorsal columns, which is fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus, dorsal spinocerebellar tract, ventral spinocerebellar tract, lateral spinothalamic, and ventral spinothalamic tract. Okay. And descending tracts are concerned with motor neurons, concerned with motor function. So they are lateral corticospinal tract, this green color, lateral corticospinal tract, rubrospinal tract, okay, ventral corticospinal tract, and vestibulospinal tract. Then let's come on to the commissures of the spinal cord. So there are two commissures in the spinal cord, which is the gray commissure and the white commissures. We talked about commissures, which are these are connecting linkages or connecting fibers between the right and the left halves of the spinal cord, right? So gray commissure, it is a transverse bridge of gray matter connecting the anterior and the posterior gray horns on each side. Okay. So anterior and posterior gray horns, they are going to be connected by the gray commissure. Okay, it is pierced by the this if you can see, this is the gray commissure, and it is pierced by the central canal that divides into the divides it into the anterior and the posterior parts. Okay, so gray commissure is the linkage between the anterior and the posterior horns of the spinal cord, right? And it is pierced by the central canal in the center. Then other type is the white commissure. It lies ventral to the gray commissure. Okay, ventral that is anterior to the gray commissure, and it mainly contains decussating nerve fibers. Decussating is nerve fibers that cross the midline to the opposite side. Okay, so white commissure, they are located more anteriorly to the gray matter, to the gray commissure, and it consists of decussating or decussating nerve fibers, which decussating means crossing the midline. Then let's talk about central canal. Here, this is the central canal. It is a cerebrospinal fluid-filled space that runs longitudinally throughout the length of the spinal cord. So we talked about meninges and CSF. So where exactly is the CSF located? It is in the central canal. Okay, it is lined by ependyma, which is a specialized epithelium, right? It is ciliated columnar epithelium. It is continuous with the ventricular system of the brain upwards, like more to the cephalid, this thing, and superiorly it opens into the fourth ventricle, and inferiorly it opens in the conus medullaris, that is the end of the spinal cord, and terminates below at the root of the phylum terminal. Okay, so this central canal, it extends from the ventricular system, right, fourth ventricle proximally, and it ends at the conus medullaris. At the exactly at the end is the root of the phylum terminal. So you can see that the central canal is extended through the entire length of the spinal cord. And since it consists of CSF, so it is responsible for most of the nutrition and this thing, pliability of the spinal cord. Then let's talk about the regional differences. So spinal cord, as we saw, it extends from the base of the brain to L2. It is going to cover your entire cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral segments. Okay. So although the general pattern of gray matter in the is almost the same throughout spinal cord, regional differences are apparent in the transverse sections. Okay. So as you can see in the picture, right, the transverse sections of all these regions are different. The amount of white matter increases in a caudal to cranial direction. So the amount of white matter here, if you can see, right, the minimum is in the sacral and maximum is in the cervical region, because fibers are added to ascending tracts and fibers leave descending tracts. Okay, so that is why since fibers are added to the ascending tracts, that means towards the this cranial region, the white matter is going to increase. And since fibers are subtracted from the descending tracts, that is why towards the sacral towards the sacral region, the white matter is going to decrease. Then the gray matter is in increased volume in cervical and lumbosacral enlargements for innervation of the upper and the lower limbs. So maximum of the or majority of the innervation in the entire body is in the upper limbs and the lower limbs. So as you can see, the gray matter here, okay, in the cervical region is going to be more, and in the lumbar region is going to be more, right? Because there are lots of muscles in the upper limb and the lower limbs. So the amount of gray matter that is going to be present in the cervical and the lumbar enlargements is also going to be more. Then the lateral horn is characteristics of thorax and upper lumbar segments. Here, if you can see here, so we saw the extension of the nerve cell groups in the lateral horn. So one of them, they started from the thoracic group, right? So here in the spinal cord, in the thoracic region, if you can see, there are more lateral horns, right? And upper lumbar region. Okay, so if you take a TS of say L1, right? So it will also consist of lateral horns. But as you proceed towards L2, L3, the lateral horns will start to disappear. Okay, now let's talk about spinal nerves. So we have already discussed that there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The first pair exit the vertebral column between the skull and the atlas. Here, if you can see in the picture, between the skull and the atlas, and the last 4 pairs exit via the sacral foramina. Here, last 4 pairs, they exit via the sacral foramina, and others exit through the intervertebral foramen. Okay, so if you can see in the picture, this initial pair is going to exit from the skull and the atlas. The last pair is going to last four pairs are going to exit through the sacral foramina, and others exit through the intervertebral foramina. Okay. We have already discussed the segmental organization. So there are 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic, 5 pairs of lumbar, 5 pairs of sacral, and 1 pair of coccygeal nerve. Okay, so each spinal nerve, it arises as rootlets first, which then combine to form the roots, which are dorsal roots and ventral roots. These two roots merge laterally and form the spinal nerve here, if you can see. Okay. Here, if you can see in the picture. Okay, so from here, here the rootlets, right? These rootlets, they will combine to form a root, which is the dorsal and the ventral root. Then two of the roots will merge laterally and form a spinal nerve. Okay. Dorsal root, it also has a ganglion that contains the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. Each spinal nerve then divides into a smaller dorsal and larger ventral ramus. Okay. So, dorsal root, we already talked about dorsal or roots in the or nerve cell groups in the dorsal horns, right? It is concerned with sensory function, right? So dorsal root here also in the spinal nerves will consist of a ganglion, which contains the cell body of the sensory neurons. Okay, and each spinal nerve, that is 31 pairs, each nerve, it is further divided into a smaller dorsal ramus, that is the posterior branch, and a larger anterior ramus. Dorsal ramus, it innervates deep muscle of the trunk responsible for movements of the vertebral column and skin near the midline of the back. Whereas the ventral ramus, they innervate, what they innervate depends upon which part of the spinal cord is considered. So if in the thoracic region, the ventral ramus, it forms the intercostal nerves that innervate the intercostal muscles and the skin over the thorax. And the remaining spinal nerves or the ventral rami form 5 plexus, that is intermingling of the nerves. Here, if you can see in the picture, this is the dorsal and this is the ventral. Okay. So, ventral ramus, again, if we're talking about it in the thoracic region, they are going to form the intercostal nerves, and remaining spinal nerves or the ventral rami, they are going to form the plexus. Okay. Now, we also talked about meninges, which cover the spinal cord. So, what exactly are meninges? They are connective tissue membranes surrounding spinal cord and the brain. And there are 3 layers of meninges, which is dura, arachnoid, and pia mater, same as in the brain, right? So, dura mater, it is continuous with the epineurium of the spinal cord. Here, if you can see in the picture, this is the dura, this is the arachnoid, and the innermost is the pia mater. Okay, arachnoid matter is thin and wispy, and pia mater is bound tightly to the surface of the brain and spinal cord. It also forms the phylum terminal, which anchors spinal cord to coccyx, and the denticulate ligaments that attach the spinal cord to the dura mater. Okay, now between these two between two meninges, there are going to be empty spaces, right? So the first space is the epidural space. It consists of blood vessels, connective tissue, and fat. Next is the subdural space. Not sure if... Yeah, okay. So here, if you can see, this is the subdural space, right? It contains serous fluid, and then there is the subarachnoid space. Here, subarachnoid space. Here, okay, which is between your arachnoid matter and pia matter, and it contains CSF and blood vessels within web-like strands of arachnoid tissue. Next, we move on to the reflex and the reflex arc, which is a major function of the spinal cord. It mediates or relays all the reflexes. So what exactly is a reflex? It is a rapid, involuntary, stereotype pattern of response brought on by a sensory stimulus. So whenever you touch a hot object, right? Immediately your hand is withdrew, right? So this is irrespective of the type of object that you touch. If the temperature is more, like that means if the object is hot, then your hand is involuntarily going to withdraw. You don't even have to think about it, right? So this is what is a reflex. It is a rapid involuntary stereotype pattern of response brought on by a sensory stimulus. So the neural pathway that is mediating the reflex action is called as the reflex arc. Here, if you can see, this entire thing is the reflex arc. Okay. What exactly are the components of a reflex arc? There are action potentials which are produced in the sensory receptor present in the periphery here. Let's say, for example, touching a hot object, right? So the sensory, sensory receptor in the skin is going to take on the sensation that the object is hot. Then it is mediated through the sensory neuron to the interneuron, right? And through the interneuron to the motor neuron here. So from the sensory receptor, the impulse goes to the spinal cord through sensory neuron here, through the interneuron, between that is the link between the sensory and the motor neuron. The impulse is transmitted through the motor neuron, and then you get a reflex. That is the withdrawing of the hand is a motor action, right? So that is an effector organ. Okay. So this is the entire reflex arc. What are the components? One, first is the sensory receptor, then the sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, and the effector organ. Okay. So the sensation is going to come from the sensory receptor, travel to the spinal cord through sensory neuron, then transmitting the impulse from the to the motor neuron through the interneurons or the connector neurons, and from the motor neuron to the effector organ. Whatever reflex that you get depending on the part, right, where the sensory stimulus has been acted, that the effector organ will differ. So when we touch a hot object, the effector organ is going to be muscles of the upper limb. Okay. If we are walking on a hot surface, right? So then the effector organs are going to be muscles of the lower limb. With this, we end the anatomy of the reflex arc. In the next session, we'll be talking more in detail about the tracts of the spinal cord. Thank you.